Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to another English Wednesdays. Today, we'll be discussing Ready for B2 first with one of the authors. Before we do that, though, I just want to remind you that you can write in questions, which we'll be discussing at the end of the session. There's a QR code there. And if you've got a QR code reader on your phone, you can just, snap it on the QR code, and it'll take you to the website where you can type in your questions. Or if you don't have a QR reader, just go to www.tuadomanda.it, and the code to get in is 1686. You can go there, type in your questions. I'll be monitoring them, and I will make sure that we have a chance in the final 5 minutes to speak to Ethan about these questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ethan, and he can take it from here.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for making time for this. And thanks to Macmillan and Montadori for inviting me to be here today. So today we're going to be talking about this idea of sort of thinking about an exam preparation course a bit more generally as a place where we can help students develop certain life skills. So to get us started, I'd like to ask you a question that you can answer in the chat box, which is, I want you to think of some of the important exams you have taken during your life. And I want you to think about sort of which ways they had a positive influence on you as a learner. Okay? So I'll just give you a chance to pop your ideas in the chat box. So someone says that Valentina says that she felt empowered after passing an exam. That's a great feeling. Somebody else has said that they taught them, exams taught them how to manage anxiety. Yes, I think sort of stress management is definitely a skill that we develop when we're sort of presented with this type of challenge. Self-confidence, great. I got accustomed to pressure. You felt you felt sort of the satisfaction of doing a good job, feeling prepared to work. I like this idea of going step by step. A lot of people are mentioning sort of the idea of sort of pressure, time management. Great. So I wanted to start here because I think that there are, there are perhaps some disadvantages to exam courses, but there's a lot that we can say about them that's really positive. They can be a really positive experience for learners. And I think that they have, a powerful effect in the sense that they can help us develop sort of skills that are sort of applicable or transferable to other aspects of our life. Some of the ones that you mentioned, time management, sort of dealing with pressure, sort of going step by step. I think that those types of things are often mentioned in sort of a group of skills that are sort of generally called life skills. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this term, but this is a nice definition that I got from a section of the Macmillan website dedicated to life skills. They have something called a life skills handbook that you might want to check out at some point. So In this webinar, I'll be sort of looking at how helping to develop this type of skill that helps sort of people deal effectively with sort of the challenge of everyday life, how that sort of overlaps quite a bit with exam preparation and how they can sort of complement each other. So we sort of life skills it's a general sort of term, and sort of almost anything could be a life skill, depending on sort of how you look at it. But there are certain ones that sort of come up again and again. Time management, sort of goals, sort of managing goals. Organization is always on there. Stress management. People are talking about sort of managing the pressure of this type of exam. Those are definitely life skills, and they're talked about quite often as being the type of skills that students ideally can develop sort of before they move on to their professional lives, and it'll help them become more successful at dealing with sort of the bigger challenges that sort of lie ahead. And so I think that thinking about these particular life skills, the ones that I've mentioned on the slide here, I think that they make sense in an exam preparation course like the one you might be doing with a book like the new edition of Ready for B2 First, for a couple of reasons. I think that when you think about these skills, they're going to help the students pass the exam. I think that's kind of the simplest reason. The more organized students are, the more likely they are going to pass this type of exam, for example. And I think the second one is a little bit more general, but also an important point to make, is that as teachers, we want our students to succeed. We want them to succeed in our course, but of course, more generally, we want them to succeed in life. And that's kind of the point of exam preparation when you think about it, is that we're trying to get students ready for sort of life in a very real way, because having one of these certificates, one of these official certificates from an examination board like Cambridge English Assessment, it makes a big difference. Doors are either opened or closed, depending on whether or not you have one of these official certificates. So we're helping them improve their English, but we're also helping them in a very specific way to help them succeed in reaching their life goals. So with that, we're going to kind of talk about each one of these in turn. So we'll start with organization. I think this is an obvious place to start, because I think we can all agree that being organized it sort of makes life easier. It makes life better. I think it's sort of a quintessential life skill in the sense that it's kind of aspirational. Some people are a lot more organized than others, but being more organized is sort of always a better thing. Most of us, I think, could feel that we could be a bit more organized, and that would be a good thing. So with exam preparation, I think a great place to start thinking about helping students become more organized is in their notebooks. So one thing that I see with students' notebooks is that they often record individual words. So, a new word will come up in a reading or in a vocabulary section in the book, and students will record that in their notebook with the translation or with a definition or a synonym, something like that. But the problem with that, it's not a bad thing by any means, but the problem with that is that that's not actually how vocabulary is tested on an exam like the B2 First. Vocabulary is tested on this exam and on most of these exams. Words are sort of tested with other words. It's often testing sort of a combination of words, like what word sounds best in this context, which word sounds good with this other word, essentially, collocations. And so that it really makes sense to help in terms of exam preparation to get students to record full sort of collocations rather than just individual words. And as you might expect, because of the way that vocabulary is tested on the B2 First exam, in a good exam preparation book like Ready for B2 First, vocabulary is taught as collocation. So you're sort of learning about kind of the grammar of words, the relationships between words. This is a nice example from the first unit of Ready for B2 First, where students are sort of encouraged to think about sort of these common collocations for the word lifestyle. So, for example, they could just be learning individual words like luxurious. That could be a good word to learn. But here we're learning it, as a collocation, a luxurious lifestyle. And, ideally students should be encouraged to record that full collocation rather than just the word luxurious, for example. And Ready for B2 First takes a very systematic approach to this type of vocabulary items. And what they do is they put them in bold. As you can see in sort of the third exercise down here, you can see where the collocation sort of is in bold. And so if that's a new collocation or a useful one for a student, they should really be encouraged to write down the full collocation rather than just an individual word that they don't know. So that's just sort of one tip for getting students to be sort of more organized in their notebook, in the sense of the way that they're sort of gathering new language. But I've got some other ones that I think are important too. So another sort of issue I see is that students often record vocabulary chronologically. They basically write down new vocabulary on a page for one class, hopefully putting a date on the top, but maybe not. And then they sort of move on, and the next class there's a new page, and the next class there's a new page. Hopefully all that is in one notebook, ideally. But when you think about it, it's not really the most organized way of gathering new language, because it makes it hard to find things. So sort of if you, for example, were doing lifestyle vocabulary and you wrote down some of that vocabulary at the beginning of the course, after 3 months, if you wanted to go back and sort of look for it and review it, it might be a bit hard to find. You need to sort of be flipping through, and and, I see students doing this. So I think it really makes a lot more sense to organize vocabulary by theme. So, for example, putting a title at the top of the page that says lifestyles, listing some new vocabulary there, vocabulary items there, and sort of making a new theme for each sort of topic that comes up in class. And that way you can kind of go back and find that vocabulary quickly and easily, and it makes it sort of easier to review it. And you can also make sections in the notebook for parts of the exam. So maybe some useful connecting words for essays, or some useful expressions for speaking part 3 or something like that. You can have sort of a section in the notebook for that. And that also creates the possibility of kind of going back and putting more things there when they come up. So for example, you might be doing sort of a speaking part 3 at the beginning of the course. You might do another one here, another one there. And the students could be sort of building up that new language, that sort of helpful functional language that'll help them do well in that part of the exam, and sort of putting it into that same page for speaking part 3, and sort of building up a sort of repertoire of useful language that they'll be using in that part of the exam. I also think that including example sentences is very useful, because it means that you're sort of recording how to use the word, and not just what it means. And of course, pronunciation as well. Pronunciation is an important part of students' mark on the speaking exam. So really, anytime they're learning new language, they should be thinking about the pronunciation of it, particularly if it sort of contains a sound that maybe they're having trouble with. I think experienced teachers, we can sort of, it's not that hard to think about which new vocabulary items are going to be more difficult for our students to pronounce, perhaps because they contain sort of a combination of consonant sounds that are sort of always difficult for our students. And sort of getting them to think about that as they record the new vocabulary. So as you can see, if you followed all that advice, you'd have a much more organized notebook that would help students do better on the exam, because it would allow them to learn things more systematically, and allow them to review it systematically as well. And it allows you as a teacher to review and revise things more systematically throughout the course as well. So, so just to give you one tip for organization, I'm going to give you a couple more related to managing time and goals. So this is sort of another kind of quintessential life skill when you think about it, very transferable, and it's very related to exam preparation. Being able to manage your time and also sort of set goals is a very valuable thing to practice and get better at. Again, it's sort of an aspirational skill, something we could probably all get a little bit better at. And one thing that I found in exam preparation courses that's really nice about it is that the objective is really clear. There's a clear goal at the end of an exam preparation course, which is passing the exam. And so it's like we're all sort of on the same page. We all know why we're there and sort of what we're doing, which is nice. Those types of objectives, of course, they exist in other courses, but they're not always quite as clear. But one thing I've also found is that because there is that sort of end goal, it can kind of seem like a mountain to climb. And sort of students are sort of looking off at it in the distance at the beginning of the course and thinking like, how am I ever going to reach the top of that mountain? And I think that if not managed sort of well, can be sort of intimidating and possibly demotivating. I think one answer to that is setting short-term goals throughout the course. Sort of helping students think about sort of incremental progress that they can make sort of week by week or month by month or term by term, so that they are seeing their progress and they're sort of seeing the road towards the sort of the top of the mountain, so to speak. Of course, this can be done in class. You can have students, you can sort of put them into pairs or small groups and ask them to think about some short-term goals for that particular month. Or even that particular week if they want to. However, in my experience, I think it makes even more sense to do it as an individual tutorial. So basically just taking sort of 5 or 10 minutes to talk to each student in the group sort of during a month, for example. So maybe you talk to one student in one class, you talk to another student in another class. You could sort of steal time away by giving the other students an open close activity to do. And this particular student's not going to do that exercise. They're going to talk to you for 5 minutes. And I think that this idea of sort of individual tutorial is a little bit more powerful in terms of setting goals because it's sort of more intimate. It feels more sort of serious. I think students maybe take it more seriously as a result. And just a note on goals. I find when I'm helping students set goals, this is not a skill that maybe they're really good at because they maybe hasn't thought about or practiced in other contexts. But what I find is students, they try to set a very general goal. So they say, I want to improve my writing. And I say, well, that's great. I'm glad you want to improve your writing, but we need something more specific. And we need something achievable, something that you can sort of, that we can see whether you've sort of gotten there or not. So for example, instead of improving your writing, maybe improving your paragraphs. Using topic sentences, having each, paragraph have a clear focus and using supporting examples. That's a clear sort of specific achievable goal that a student could hypothetically reach within a month. If they were doing some practice writing, you could kind of look at that in the next tutorial and say, look, like I can see a clear difference now. You're definitely doing much better with your paragraph organization. Let's think about the next goal. Or if they haven't reached it, maybe giving them some more further advice or something to help them reach that goal. And so again, so revisiting these goals and setting new ones throughout the course, it can be very encouraging, very motivating. And again, it's helping them develop a valuable life skill at the end of the day. This idea of sort of the ability to set sort of short-term achievable sort of specific goals. Another activity that I've done with my students is called a future interview. So this is, again, sort of getting them to think about sort of the course as a whole and think about sort of what effective exam preparation looks like. So basically the idea is that you put students in pairs and they sort of role play an interview where they pretend like they've already passed the exam. And then they ask each other questions about how they got there. So you could sort of do this the opposite way. You could put them in pairs and have them think about sort of challenges that they might face reaching their goal. But if you kind of do it backwards, if you kind of start from the place of having finished the exam, you're sort of starting from a position of power and sort of confidence, which is nice. And I find that it can be a very engaging activity and also very useful to get students thinking about, yeah, the type of challenges they might face, the things that are going to hold them back. And so, yeah, so this is, by the way, it's a worksheet that I created for the teacher's book for the Ready for B2 First course. Yeah, these are just some of the questions that are on that worksheet. So, for example, who helped you? What advice would you give other students to help them pass? And sort of, I have one more activity that I think is also very interesting and engaging. That's sort of based on the same idea. So instead of basically having students pretend that they're interviewing each other from the point of view of having finished the exam, you can actually invite someone to the class who has passed the exam. So for example, I work in a private language school, so it's not that hard to find a student in a C1 group, for example, that's already passed the B2 first exam. Often I get a former student to do this. So they come to class for 10 or 15 minutes. The students sort of prepare some questions for them about how they passed the exam. And they just have a conversation. Basically, they're sort of interviewing the guest about how they passed the exam. And I find that it's a very interesting activity because the student is often giving the same advice that I would give, not surprisingly. But because it's coming from a peer and not from a teacher, I think that students, they're paying attention in a different way, or they're taking it seriously in a different way. Like, I think it sort of gets into their heads a little bit in a different way, maybe, than if I was telling them the same thing. So again, a very sort of easy, sort of low prep or no prep in this case activity that you could do to help students think about, achieving goals, setting goals, and also managing their time within the course of what's really worth spending time on and what might be a waste of time, that kind of thing. So the next life skill I'd like to talk about are social skills. So this is sort of a very broad category that includes lots of different things. But I do think that it's something that is interestingly included in the Cambridge exams that's not included in other exams when you think about it. Because one big difference with the Cambridge exams is that they have students talk to another student, which is very interesting when you think about it, because they don't do that on other exams. They don't do that on IELTS. They don't do it on Trinity. It's really interesting because it's Cambridge basically telling all of the teachers preparing for the course that they have to do pair work in class when you think about it, because if students can be talking in pairs on the exam, then that sort of automatically means that any pair work, any sort of talking together in class is essentially exam preparation. It's sort of preparing them for that part of the exam. And not to say that teachers like me and you, we don't necessarily need encouragement to do pair work. We sort of know how valuable that is. But that may not be true for every teacher, there still might be teachers out there that sort of prefer a lecture style type of class where students aren't talking in pairs or small groups quite as much. And it also kind of justifies pair work. It sort of gives it value in a very real and applicable way. And so when you think about it, it's also sort of encouraging students to do things, in pairs, sort of throughout the course, and you can imagine that also has a big effect on course books as well. So again, not that Macmillan needs advice about getting students to work in pairs. They do it throughout all of their books. But you'll find that sort of whenever it's possible, a book like Ready for B2 First, it tries to integrate this idea of pair work, integrate sort of interaction into the book as much as possible. And that's the example here. We looked at this before, this vocabulary exercise. But when you look at it, actually sort of half of the exercise is really just students working in pairs and sort of, practicing the new vocabulary, but also working in pairs, which is what they're going to have to do on the exam. And One interesting thing about the way that Cambridge has constructed their exam is that because of the pair sort of talking interaction that happens within the exam between two candidates, they've actually added that to the assessment criteria. So when an official examiner is listening to students on the day of the exam, in the speaking exam, they're listening for something called interactive communication. And so actually that's 1/4 of the speaking mark, which is quite a lot of points, actually, when you think about it. So it sort of means that somebody's grammar and vocabulary could be sort of not great. It could be sort of not up to the B2 level. But if their interactive communication is good, if they're listening, if they're actually sort of actively listening to what the other person is saying and responding to it, and they're doing that sort of, and they sort of manage to keep going and develop the interaction, they can sort of pull up what might sort of be a poor performance in terms of grammar vocabulary, and sort of compensate for it. So, Cambridge is sort of valuing social skills like active listening. And this is actually what it says in the Cambridge handbook. This is sort of the where Cambridge sort of sets out the specifications of the exam. And to get sort of top marks on interaction in the speaking exam, you don't have to do a whole lot. You just have to sort of start and sort of respond. You have to sort of contribute to the conversation, basically, and stay on topic, that kind of thing. And you also have to sort of listen and sort of link your contribution. So you have to be sort of actively listening to what the other person says and responding to it. And by the way, this is the top mark. So this is actually C2, technically, for communicative interaction. However, I think this is sort of within the reach of every single candidate who does the speaking exam. There's no reason why any student can't do these things. And what I like about this is that the student themselves is essentially in full control here about how many, sort of what mark they're going to get in terms of interaction. That's really not true in terms of vocabulary and grammar. Students aren't necessarily in control of sort of how good the grammar is that they're going to use. But here they can choose to listen actively. They can choose to sort of listen and respond to what their partner is saying instead of simply just sort of doing a monologue and talking about their own ideas and opinions. They can build on the opinions or ideas that their partner has mentioned. And this is sort of Cambridge in a sense, sort of valuing this life skill of social skills of active listening. And I sort of got a little bit obsessed with this idea of focusing on interaction in my classes because, again, I think it's important and I like it because students have so much control over it. And I think that they can get better at it pretty quickly if they focus on it, which is not always the case with grammar vocabulary. That sort of takes longer to help students with. So one activity that I designed for the teacher's book for this course is called The Debate with a Mediator. So basically, this activity is meant to practice those two things we mentioned earlier, basically sort of working together and talking with somebody, but also sort of actively listening and incorporating their ideas. And so basically the way it works is that students do a debate like they would normally in class. However, one student is in the role of the mediator, and that student sort of listens and takes notes during the debate. And then there's sort of a second stage where that mediator sort of takes control of the debate and tries to find common ground between the two sides in the debate. And during this type of activity, it's of course not exactly what the students will be doing on the day of the exam, but it is sort of helping them to hopefully develop that that sort of awareness of the importance of interaction and how valuable it is on this particular exam. By the way, I think Kazimir can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think these handouts, these worksheets are included in the handout that you can get from this this webinar. So now that we've talked about managing time and goals, as well as organization, we can move on to writing skills. So this might seem sort of less like an obvious life skill than perhaps sort of time management. However, being able to write well is super useful. I think we can all agree that it's really nice to receive like a clear, kind of well-organized email. And it's not very fun to receive an email that's sort of hard to follow and sort of difficult to understand. Being able to sort of express yourself clearly in writing is very valuable in many different sort of aspects of life. And on this particular exam, students are sort of trained in writing a few very useful genres of writing. There are some that are arguably less useful. For example, a review. It's very interesting to have students write reviews. It's a nice thing to write, but the number of students that are going to go on to sort of write a lot of reviews maybe aren't that many. However, that's not true of emails. So formal and informal emails, being able to write one of those sort of concisely and clearly in English is a very useful skill. The report, for example, is so in a business type of environment, you might not be writing exactly the type of report that Cambridge wants you to write, but the training that you get in writing and learning to write a report in English, again, very useful. And in terms of sort of the academic domain, I think learning to write an essay effectively is another great skill, because you're always going to have to write an essay at some point during your university career, no matter what you're studying. And I just want to point out again that the way that Cambridge has designed their assessment criteria is very interesting, because they're valuing sort of good writing skills as well as good English. So they take into consideration language, of course. Students have to be writing in good English, but actually almost like sort of half their mark is actually not really sort of linguistic based. It's not based on grammar or vocabulary. Content is basically, are you answering the question? Are you sort of incorporating the points that they sort of want you to address into the answer? And organization is organization, So again, I think it makes a lot of sense in an exam preparation course to help students develop their ability to sort of write something that's focused, that's on message, that's well organized. And again, that's a great life skill. And I can't tell how many times students have sort of told me sort of during or after an exam preparation course that they improve their writing in an exam preparation course, because this type of course because writing is so important on the exam, it ends up, students get focused sort of lessons on how to write better, which is not always the case sort of in school. I'm sure students are learning how to write as well in school, of course, all the time, but this sort of extra focus on writing can often be quite beneficial to students. And I've often had students tell me that they think they've improved their writing in their own language, that they've sort of learned some transferable skills in terms of how to sort of structure discourse and how to connect their ideas, that kind of thing. And as you can probably imagine, because of the importance of those writing skills in the assessment criteria on the official exam, a book like Ready for B2 First, it focuses on developing students' writing skills as well. So in the writing sections in this book, you're not just getting a bunch of sort of English expressions that are going to be useful for that part of the exam, although you do get that. What you get is a lot of sort of training in useful writing strategies, sort of, brainstorming before you write something, planning, the power of looking at a model of something that you're going to write first, how to structure paragraphs. These are all sort of general, sort of transferable writing skills, which students can apply to their writing, after they pass an exam like this. And of course, helping them develop those skills is going to help them do better on the exam as well. So I just want to finish with stress management. This was one that came up quite a lot in the chat box at the beginning of the talk. And Yeah, I think it's definitely something we think about when we think about exam preparation. And there's definitely pressure during the course, but I find that the most sort of intense stress that my students experience, at least that I've noticed, sort of comes towards the end of the course when they're getting close to taking the real exam. That's when sort of the pressure starts to take hold. And so I was going to talk about a few ways that you might be able to sort of manage that stress. Maybe not sort of eliminate it or necessarily reduce it, but manage it. And I think that a very sort of powerful idea, I think, in terms of stress management is that sort of this expression in English that knowledge is power. And I think it's never been more true in the terms of exam preparation. Like the more you know about the exam, the more you understand kind of the logic of the exam. For example, the better you understand that sort of assessment criteria that we talked about earlier, the better you understand sort of how important it is to listen actively during the speaking exam, or how important it is to use sort of well-structured paragraphs during the writing. The more you understand about that kind of thing, the more sort of control, the more confidence you have going in, and the more control you have over sort of your performance when you think about it. And of course, a book like Ready for B2 First is very systematic. Going through a book like this will help students, they'll know the exam sort of back and front. The author for this course, Roy Norris, knows this exam better than anybody, I promise you. And this book, it definitely will prepare students in the sense of familiarizing them with the exam and the assessment criteria and so on and so forth. However, I think as teachers, we can kind of take it one step further, because I find that at the end of sort of a course, students start to get nervous. They start to think about the exam day, and I think that sort of minimizing any kind of surprise on the exam day is important, because students are going to go in feeling a bit stressed out, no matter what. But if there are sort of things that are unexpected or things they didn't quite understand, those can they're called sort of stressors. That type of stressor on exam day can sort of multiply the stress that students are already feeling. So I think that sort of one way of minimizing that kind of element of surprise on the exam is to kind of bring the exam to class. So one obvious way of doing that is a mock exam, getting students to actually sit down and do a full reading and use of English exam from start to finish. And doing something like that, it really gives students a good idea of how much time they have. Are they doing it too fast? Are they sort of rushing through it and getting things wrong that they could get right if they slow down? Or are they just going way too slow and they're never going to finish in time? And are they going to have like 2 readings left at the end and be really stressed out about that? I think that sort of getting students to think about timing in general, timing the writing, for example, using timing when you're sort of role playing the speaking exam, maybe putting a student in the role of the examiner, for example, who keeps the time, so that students, while they're practicing for the speaking exam, they're practicing with the official timing, so that on the exam day, they're not sort of shocked when the examiner cuts them off after a minute, during the monologue or something. So, everything's going to feel familiar on exam day. They're going to feel more comfortable because they've sort of been there before, having practiced it in class. And one final thing is, I think that using official mark sheets is also very interesting and useful. I don't think that students should see that official mark sheet for the first time on the official exam. They should have sort of ideally had some practice filling those out in class beforehand. Because when you think about it, if they fill them out wrong, which is easy enough to do if you're sort of stressed out on an exam, and they could get a bunch of answers wrong that they actually got right. When they look at that mark sheet, it should look familiar to them. It shouldn't be sort of new. And by the way, these types of sort of an imitation of the official mark sheet is available on the teacher's app for this course. You can sort of easily just download it and bring it to class. And so once you've kind of gotten students to practice the exam, once you've sort of simulated the exam in class and gotten them feeling sort of more comfortable, they're familiar with the exam now. I think at that point, sort of towards the end, you can get them to do like a brainstorm activity where they think about possible problems that they might face on the exam day. So for example, the mark sheet, like what happens if I fill out some of the answers wrong and I realize that I filled them out wrong? Can I just erase them and then put in the right answers, or is it gonna count against me somehow? Like that type of sort of typical problem is sort of easy to think of for students, I think, and it's also easy to kind of brainstorm possible solutions to it. So in that case, of course, students can just erase and then fill in the bubble or the lozenge or whatever you want to call it on the exam paper. Again, and as long as this lozenge is a lot darker than the other one, the computer is going to count it correctly. So yeah, just getting students to think about sort of possible solutions, possible problems, possible solutions. Yeah, like what happens if I'm doing the reading and use of English and I have an entire reading left and I only have 5 minutes and I still haven't put my answers on the mark sheet? Like, what do I do? Well, you should definitely be putting your answers on that mark sheet and forget about that reading and just guess, so that if you do, God forbid, if you do sort of experience one of those stressful situations on the exam, at least you've kind of thought about a solution to it that's going to come to mind, hopefully a bit faster, and sort of reduce the stress that you'd be feeling in that situation. So today we've talked about some possible life skills that might be worth focusing on in exam courses, and in fact are sort of indirectly focused on in this course book we've mentioned throughout. And we've talked about organization. We've talked about time management and goals, stress management. So just to finish with, I'd like you to put in the chat box sort of which activities or sort of which ideas or advice that's come up during the presentation that you think you're going to kind of take to class with you, that you think is sort of an interesting or worthwhile idea. So if you could just put your ideas in the chat box, that would be great. So somebody liked the setting goals, the future interview activity. So people like that one. People like this debate with mediator. I think that's come up a couple of times now. Yes, I've done that activity a number of times with my students. It's very interesting, very very engaging, and as I said, it's useful for practicing those valuable interaction skills. Okay, yeah, we had a look at some of the writing and the speaking assessment. Great, people like the future interview. Again, a very interesting and engaging activity. That worksheet will be available to you as part of the handout. Inviting a guest, people like that one as well. Yep. Great. That's sort of all for me, and it's good to see that that so many people have gotten some useful ideas out of this talk. I think that exam preparation can be a very interesting and engaging course to teach, and I think focusing on these types of life skills can kind of spice things up too. It can sort of change the pace a little bit, change the focus in a useful way. So I think at this point, Kashmir, maybe you could have a look at those questions that hopefully have come up, and we can just have a chat. Kazimir, I can't hear you. Can the other participants hear you?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I don't know how many
Classic,
times I've
classic
done it the last
moment.
2 years. Sorry about that. No, but I just wanted to comment on something that one of the teachers had written in the chat box here about setting goals. Because I find with teenagers especially, and I think almost everyone that's here today works with teenagers, and I certainly did for many years. A lot of times, like things like setting goals, it's absolutely critical. But one of the things I struggle with was getting, I could get the motivated students to do it, and they may have done that by themselves anyway without my, encouragement. What about the kind of the middle of the pack students, the students that are maybe getting good enough to think about doing the B2, but they're not they might be very smart, but they're just not as motivated as some of the top level students. How do you engage those students to do things like setting goals, which is absolutely critical for passing the first?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. As you said, some students will be good at this already, and that's often the case with life skills. Students are often bringing in a lot of transferable skills to this type of course that's really going to help them, such as setting goals. Other students are not bringing in those skills, obviously. So I think that that's actually one reason why I've settled on this idea of the individual tutorial, because I sort of did this as a group activity sort of years ago, or a pair work activity. And students would do the activity in class, and I think they weren't just paying lip service to. I think they thought that they really were going to work on those goals. And as you said, sort of the more motivated students would actually do it, and then the other ones would sort of not do it. But I think that if you do it as a tutorial, you're sort of making students more accountable. So that if it's just you and that one student, and I realize that some teachers are working with a lot of students. If you have 30 students in your class, you may only be able to make time for one tutorial every term or something. But it's still worth doing, because even if those sort of middle of the pack students, as you called them, set one goal for the term, and they're sort of accountable for that goal later because they know that they're going to meet up with you again, and you're going to want to see some progress. You're going to want to see some evidence that they've reached that sort of achievable short-term goal that you set together. That accountability sort of it does improve. It doesn't mean that every student is going to take the activity seriously, but I do think that it increases the likelihood of them taking it seriously.
Yeah. Okay. And also, I think that, sometimes the closer to the exam the students start to get, there's a bit of fear that helps motivate them.
Yes. Nothing like fear to motivate. We like to call that external motivation to make it.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. And also there was some other comments about stress management. That's another thing that I think teenagers, really have to learn. That's another, I guess, life skill, you might say. But so I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to mention on that, because there seem to be a few kind of open-ended questions. Is that something that you're going to teach them at the start, or is that something you kind of prepare as you get closer to the exam day?
Yeah, so I think that stress is certainly experienced throughout the course, I imagine. But I have to say that I have students sort of coming up to me and talking about it, or bringing it up during those tutorials that I mentioned that I do. They start to bring them up or come to me sort of more often at the end of the course. So I think that's when I start thinking about it. I think that it can definitely be useful to teach students certain stress management techniques like visualization. You can do a visualization activity in class where you have the students sort of close their eyes and imagine walking into the exam room. Things like that are definitely useful. Learning sort of mindfulness type of activities. There's something called box breathing, where you sort of you sort of take a breath, you hold it, and then you let it out, and you hold it. Tips for sort of dealing with an eventual stress. However, I think that it's better to think about kind of managing stress rather than sort of eliminating it or something using mindfulness because at the end of the day, stress is actually a good thing. We don't often think of it that way, but actually your stress is sort of your body getting ready to do something important. And actually it's your body kind of releasing adrenaline and other sort of chemicals that are going to allow you to sort of super perform. And when you think about it, like sometimes like students can kind of feel exhausted after doing one intense reading in class. Like they've been doing a reading for 15 minutes and they need a little break because they've been concentrating so much. But on the exam day, they sit there and they do the entire use of English in one bang. And that's because they're sort of super performing. The stress has kind of prepared them for that. So it's really more like managing the stress, because stress is good until it becomes panic or it becomes anxiety. And sort of, and as I mentioned before, that I think it makes a lot of sense to think about individual stress, things that could stress you on exam day, individual stressors, and how to manage those so you don't sort of tip into panic on exam day. That's sort of how I deal with it in my class. But I'm sure lots of teachers out there would have lots of other great ideas for this.
Okay. Let me just interrupt you a second there, and you can continue to put questions into the sheet there. But in the meantime, another question regarding debates. And giving feedback like during the debate, so you do need to give your students latitude in order to speak and explain themselves. You also shouldn't, as everyone knows, you shouldn't just step in and correct every single error that a student is making. But the question here seems to be asking more like, do you wait to the end to give feedback, or can you intervene if if one of the participants is really struggling? How do you handle feedback in these
Yes,
debates?
so this is an interesting one. So maybe I'm going to say something controversial, but as I mentioned before, on the actual speaking exam, grammar vocabulary is only 1/4 of your mark, actually. And interaction actually counts just as much.
Right.
So when you're thinking about success on that exam, interaction is exactly as important as correct grammar and vocabulary. So I think if you're going to be doing an activity that's focused on interaction, that you want students to get better at interaction, I think that should be the single feedback. I don't think I like unless you have an error or a mistake that's sort of disrupting the activity, that's stopping, this is becoming a problem. Obviously, you should sort that out. But I would say when I give feedback on this particular activity, when I do it with my students, I ignore all grammar mistakes and I focus on how the interaction went. I try to write down examples of good examples of students actually listening to each other and responding to what the other person said. And I also write down examples of when students weren't listening very well and sort of misunderstood something that someone else said, and sort of pointing to both those as sort of examples of sort of good interaction and interaction that could be better. Writing down examples of where students were sort of working together, sort of co-constructing a dialogue rather than just individual people giving their individual opinions. So like my feedback stage after this exam, this debate with mediator task, for example, is solely focused on interaction, because as I said, it's exactly as important as grammar vocabulary on the exam, and I think it deserves equal focus if you want to think about sort of what's going to help the student actually do good on the exam.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And actually, I think I see a comment here. Angela Fantini says just at the end. So I think she would agree with what you were saying just now. Take notes and then provide that feedback at the end rather than stepping in and kind of breaking the student's concentration or something.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I agree.
Okay, I think that's pretty much it. The one kind of question I seem to be repeated over and over, the one comment, is pretty much about stress management. So I get a feeling that that's something that teachers are really seeing a lot with, regarding has the do you think the pandemic has any impact on that, or not really? That's
Impact on how much stress students are experiencing? Is that the question?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, do you think that like I don't know. Do you think that something like the pandemic can influence students, marks on an exam like this?
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact that a lot of students were disrupted by the pandemic. They had an exam date that they couldn't go to because it got canceled. For example, that can't feel good. To have gone through all this preparation and kind of be ready psychologically, and also sort of, and then not be able to do it for who knows how long. In fact, right now, at least at my school, we're sort of catching up and doing a ton of exams right now, sort of catch up for all the students that wanted to do it before but couldn't. I'm sure that's affected their performance, unfortunately. But one thing I was going to mention is I think, to try to look at the sort of silver lining, but I think one thing this pandemic really has highlighted, at least in terms of professional development, is a stronger focus on student well-being. I think it was always something that we thought about as teachers, of course, or something that we were doing all along. But I don't think that we were always thinking about it as sort of part of the course. We were thinking about it as something extra. Whereas I think nowadays with our students having experienced, the trauma and stress of this pandemic, I think that that's come to the forefront. I think that's something that hopefully we'll keep in mind going forward. That our students do need to be well, sort of both physically and mentally, in order to perform. I mean, I think we can all think of a time when our own wellness was either standing in the way or helping us reach a goal, and that if we hadn't been sort of well, that we wouldn't have reached that goal. And I think that sort of focusing on things like managing goals and managing stress and things like that, hopefully it'll go a small way towards helping students maintain sort of the well-being that they need in order to succeed in their life goals, including passing a competitive exam like this one.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really agree with that. Again, it's become part of it's much more of a focus now, students' well-being, than it was in the past. So there is one final question here. So I'll ask you this. It's kind of not connected to what we were talking about before, but it's a good question, so I'll bring this one up. Could it be useful to tell short stories that they have to finish? So in the final 30 seconds, maybe you could give some insight into that. So you might provide a story. I think you must have done activities like this in the classroom, but you provide the first part of the story and get the student to kind of invent the second part of the story.
I mean, storytelling is great, right? I mean, everyone loves a good story. So yeah, no, storytelling is great. I mean, if your students are doing the B2 first exam for schools, I believe that still includes a story. I might be wrong about that, but traditionally that exam has included the possibility of writing a story. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a great activity. I was actually just writing an activity like that for another course book recently. I think that stories are powerful, even in an exam preparation context. And that's why Cambridge has included it on their for schools exam.
There we go. So yeah, I think that's a good way to answer that question. It's on this for schools exam, therefore I think it's probably a really good activity. So
yeah, definitely.
Well, Ethan, I think we've taken up all your time. So thanks everyone for participating. Thanks for all the questions. And I hope to see you again in 2 weeks on our next English Wednesday session. So thanks. Have a great evening, and we'll see you around. Bye, everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.